Good evening and welcome to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University for tonight's Embry-Riddle Speaker Series event. I'm Marc Bernier, moderator for tonight's event this evening. The definition of cosmology is the science of the origin and development of the universe. Modern astronomy is dominated by the Big Bang theory, which brings another observational astronomy and particle physics. It's also defined as an account or theory of the origin of the universe. Our subject tonight in the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series. We have two dynamic guests to look at it and also take your questions from the audience. We found this gentleman as a result of Reverend David Keck's suggestion to me a year ago when we saw the book, Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? The title was compelling. So we have brought in the co-author of that book. He is Brother Guy Consolmagno, a scientist at the Vatican Observatory who earned a degree from MIT and did postgraduate work at MIT as well, and divides his time between Italy and the United States. He was appointed to his position last fall by his boss, who happens to be the Pope, Pope Francis. Also, Reverend David Keck, who is a chaplain here at Embry-Riddle, and besides his great schooling too and studies at Yale and Harvard, he has been with us as chaplain now for the last 2 years. Ladies and gentlemen, Brother Guy, Reverend Keck. Have the advantage of having had lunch with you today too. I said, where do I even begin with this? And I think that the topic bears to the audience from people who are here who are scientists or students, and they're also people of faith. I guess I want to begin with you, Brother Guy, and ask, why does the Pope have a bunch of astronomers on the payroll anyway?
Don't you think that every faith ought to have an astronomy, an astronomical observatory? Wouldn't it be great if each church supported astronomy? Because astronomy, if nothing else, draws you out of yourself and makes you realize that there are bigger questions in the world than what's for lunch. There is, of course, a history behind this. We also use astronomy to set our calendars, and the Pope specifically hired astronomers in the 1580s to develop what became the Gregorian calendar, named for Pope Gregory XIII. Among those was a Jesuit priest named Christopher Clavius. Anybody who's seen the movie 2001 knows about the crater Clavius that they landed, named for Christopher Clavius. There are, in fact, 35 craters on the moon named for Jesuits. The guy who made the map was a Jesuit. That helps. And since then, the Pope has been paying, either through the universities or directly as part of the Vatican, people to do astronomy. But in the late 19th century, 125 years ago, in 1891, Pope Leo XIII had a specific reason to found anew a national observatory for the Vatican. Part of it was politics. The Vatican was desperate to be recognized as an independent nation in those days. Having your own observatory was a sign of nationhood. But really the reason was more philosophical. There was, at the end of the 19th century, a new idea being invented that the church and science were opposed to each other. This is not a traditional idea. It does not go back to Galileo. It does not go back to the Middle Ages. It was a late 19th century idea. And the Pope wanted to try to nip it in the bud. You can say, oh, well, that turned out. But he said, let's establish an observatory just to show the world that we support good science. Nowadays, just to let me end on this note, the people who we most have to remind this of are church people, who are often afraid of science. So I'm here to remind church people that science is ours. We invented it. Don't let the atheists steal it.
Does science and religion have different ways of accepting fact?
Actually, no. And I think one of there are two big fallacies in the whole science-religion debate. It's interesting to get them out. One is what was sometimes called the wall, that I do religion one day of the week and I do science the other 6 days of the week, or that I don't let one influence the other. You don't want to use the Bible to do science. You don't want to use science to try to prove or disprove God. I can see that. But you have to remember that every scientist is also a human being. It's the same person who's worshiping on Sunday and doing science the rest of the week. They have to talk to each other. The other big, I got this from talking to one of the great scientists of our day, Captain Kirk. I had a chance to talk with William Shatner, who's in his 80s now and still sharp as a tack, very bright guy. And as I mentioned being a Jesuit and being a scientist, he goes, but wait a minute, he says, science has a certain bunch of facts and religion has a certain bunch of facts, and what happens if they contradict? And that's when I realized he thinks, as a lot of people do, that science is a big book of facts, because that's the way we teach science to 10-year-olds. And he thinks that religion is a big book of facts, because that's how we teach religion to 10-year-olds. And you realize that when you have a 10-year-old's idea of science and religion, and then you never learn beyond that, you're not going to appreciate that both science and religion are a combination of insight, intuition, and responding to evidence. Pope John Paul II had a marvelous piece about 20 years ago that starts out that faith and reason are the wings, the two wings that bring us to the truth. And a lot of people hearing that say, oh, faith, that must mean religion, and reason, that must mean science. No. Science depends on faith. Religion depends on reason. Both need both. No one would believe in a religion if they didn't have some experience that made them say, all right, here's something going on, I've got to try to make sense of it. No one would do science if they didn't have an insight to say, there's something curious here, and I'll bet you this is the experiment that will uncover it.
So that addresses a point I wanted you to speak to as well. You live in a world of science. You believe in God. We have some folks in our audience who are scientists who do not believe in God, and they're wondering, why do we need God?
I think science needs God to be able to do science. Every rational system has to start with axioms. And whether or not your rational system leads you to believe in God or not believe in God generally depends on the axioms you chose ahead of time. But to do science, think of the things you have to believe without evidence. You have to believe that the physical universe really exists, that this is not an illusion, you're not just something that I'm imagining because I had too much pie for dinner. You have to believe, and of course, quantum physicists, I'm not too sure if they believe that, but the rest of us, to do science, you have to believe there's something there to study. To do science, you have to believe that the physical universe operates according to rules. Now, we're happy with that because we found the rules and it seems to work, but the first person to go looking for rules, how did they have any idea that that was going to be the case? In ancient Rome, when you saw a lightning flash, you said, oh, the god of lightning did that. And that was your answer. When you saw crops growing, you say, oh, the goddess of crops did that. You've got your answer. If you believe that everything happens in the universe because of some gods, some nature gods, there's no room for you to look for different questions, for different explanations, and your society isn't going to let you because it's blasphemy. So to be a scientist, the first thing you have to be is almost an atheist. I only believe in one more God than Stephen Hawking. There are a lot of gods I don't believe in. And so you see, you have to have this religious faith to do science. But the last and the strangest thing is you have to believe that the universe is worth studying. That it's not, that piece of pie I had was not God luring me to my fate, but rather that it was a glorious expression of his love for me that he could make coconut cream pies. And if you believe that the universe is good and is a source of joy and is an expression of the Creator God who made us and loved us, then doing the science is an act of worship. And I can convince everybody else here to support me doing the science because we all recognize that it's an act of worship.
When Reverend Keck gave me his book to borrow, and then I ended up getting it as a gift, when I saw the title, Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? And I'm Christian, I thought, slam dunk, yeah.
Quick, get there before
next
the other
page,
guys.
book continued. I mean, if an extraterrestrial accepted Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior, as Christians do, wouldn't it be automatic that extraterrestrial, if they could communicate, would be baptized?
Even more than that, we have in our tradition the idea of baptism by desire. We have in Karl Rahner's phrase, the anonymous Christian. If you are responding to that same thing that causes us to be believers, if you're responding to that same invitation to accept a universe that has something outside the universe, supernatural, who wants to be in communion with us, who's offering us the choice to love or not love, and we choose to love, we're already living in the kingdom of God.
Before I turn things over to Reverend Keck and get his vision here, I've got to ask you this. I struggle with this question because I'm like, I'm not going to trip him up. I'm not going to try to ask him anything crazy, but how do you reconcile the Big Bang Theory in the account in the book of Genesis? And how about how God created the world? How do you reconcile that?
Can I borrow your book?
Yes.
Yeah, we were talking about this
We didn't
coming
set
over.
this up, folks.
No. And it's a big old Bible. And as you can see, it's kind of tattered. He's had it for a few years. How many years have you had this?
About 20.
I've got on my shelf a book that I used in graduate school called Gravitation by Misner, Thorne, and Wheeler. It's about the same size. And it's, maybe 30 years old. The stuff in the Bible, of course, is 3,000 years old. Misner, Thorne, and Wheeler is out of date. Every astronomy book, by the time it's printed, is out of date. Is there anybody here who's taking a biology who would use the same biology book that your mom used? You'd be crazy to. On the other hand, anybody here who's taking a course in Shakespeare and you had the same copy of Shakespeare that your mom used, you'd go, sure, why not? There are different kinds of books. There are books that are themselves the thing you study, and then there are the interpretations. And the science book is just the interpretation of the universe. The universe hasn't changed in 3,000 years. How we interpret it has. So the Bible is not a science book. That would make it a piece of secondary literature, like science books are. If you try to treat the Bible like a science book, you're doing a terrible disjustice to it. It'd be like taking Macbeth, the opening scene, the witches are going bubble, bubble, toil and trouble, and saying, oh, that must be a cookbook. You're completely missing the point of what the author is trying to say. Now, as it happens, the Bible does have interesting things to say about the creation of the universe. First of all, it says, unlike other theories, it was a deliberate act. It wasn't a mistake like the Babylonians thought. It was a deliberate act by a God who is already there before the universe is created and therefore not part of the universe, unlike the Roman gods who are nature gods in the universe. And it says, it's interesting to think about a universe that has a beginning. Now, when the Big Bang Theory was first proposed, looking at the universe, looking at Einstein's theory of general relativity, recognizing that that theory of gravity, if you didn't have something else going on, would cause the universe to collapse into a point. And the fact that it hadn't happened meant maybe it started with an initial condition of expansion outwards, which had been observed. And then the theorist said, well, I can see this in the mathematics. Of course, if the universe is expanding now, when it was smaller, it would have been more energetic per cubic centimeter. The same energy, smaller volume, higher energy density, we mean that that's temperature. And if you extrapolate to the beginning, all of that material would be in one point, infinitely. And he called it the cosmic egg. And it was only the atheist cosmologist Fred Hoyle who made fun of that theory and called it the Big Bang theory. The reason Fred Hoyle hated it is he hated the idea of a universe with a beginning, and he was very suspicious of the theory because the guy who came up with the theory that we now call the Big Bang, Georges Lemaitre, happened to be a Catholic priest.
Wow.
With a degree from MIT.
Reverend Keck, you also, in your history, in your life, you've been a historian. You have studied history as well as faith. Do you feel as science makes advances, it puts pressure on those who have the accounts of history to back off some of the historical accounts because science may prove otherwise?
Well, take the example of the Big Bang expansion of the universe. If you go back hundreds of years, you could find a diagram of the Earth and the stars, and you can see in a small picture the Earth with a couple of circles around it, and that was it, a pretty small, compact, understandable universe. And now we have this image of expansion and larger, and we might think, yes, this is a great threat to a conceptualizable universe that we can understand and relate to a creator who's put things together like a series of clock wheels that fits into my little head. But then I think of the great poem by Dante, and as he, in the Divine Comedy, as he journeys through hell and purgatory and into heaven, his culminating vision is described as a vision of the love that moves the sun and the other stars. And I put those two together and I say, the love that moves the sun and the other stars is expanding. It is becoming greater and more powerful and more wondrous. So I think that if we, again, back to how we interpret, how we set this up, if we see the science and developments and learning as a way of growing in wonder and in awe, we might get rid of smaller universes, smaller pictures, and as our picture gets bigger, our sense of amazement, our OMG sense, what is that? Oh my God. Yeah, okay. That gets bigger. And so while we sometimes wrestle with things and it's always difficult to undo certainties, we were talking at lunch about Mrs. Kipe, my 6th grade science teacher, who told us there were 9 planets. And I still wrestle with this. I think there are 9. All in favor? So when Pluto got demoted, that hurt.
Yeah.
That hurt.
I was lost.
Yeah. So when I think of all the students who in their 6th grade test wrote 8 planets, how many planets are there? 8. They should have gotten a correct answer, right? So, the losing of a certainty can yield to a greater sense of knowledge, of trust, of wonder, of gratitude, that sense of expansion. I love that image is of the love that moves the universe, that fills our hearts and gives us hope, is this wonderfully expanding, more awesome thing. So I don't see necessarily that we have that conflict. And I think I invite us into the sense of wonder.
There is a writer in England, a journalist named Emma Townshend. Mm-hmm. And she's written about her childhood growing up and the gradual realization that her daddy was actually the famous rock musician Pete Townshend. And I think we're children that way, that as we grow up, we realize that the God we've been worshiping is constantly turning out to be bigger and more spectacular than we ever thought, because we could not have imagined before how big and spectacular this creator was.
You have, I don't know how many of you know this, but Brother Guy has an asteroid named after him. It's called Little Guy. No, I'm serious, right? Is that what it's called?
Nah, it's a terrible rumor. It's just called 4790, I've already forgotten.
Yeah, there was a number assigned to it.
4597.
Like an Amazon catalog number.
Well, it's mostly important because it's a 4-digit number. And the new asteroids that they're assigning now are 6-digit numbers. They found so many asteroids. So yes, they made an asteroid of me. What can I say?
So you have a student walk up to you and say, creationism, evolution. What do you say?
Yes.
Gotta go.
Creationism is one of those words that means whatever you want it to mean.
Okay.
And the people who identify themselves this way are doing so, I think, as a way of saying, this is where I stand in the culture wars. And I can appreciate that, and I can respect that. There's an awful lot of modern culture that's really dreadful. Guess what? There was an awful lot of culture that I was growing up with 50 years ago that was also dreadful. And we've just sort of moved. I think there's a conservation of dreadful. As you fix one thing, another thing begins to go sour. And I can appreciate people who want to say that I am opposed to the way that people are misusing and abusing the sense of science to push their own agendas. Although, in fact, we all wind up doing that. I also have no problem saying that because I believe in God who's a creator, I'm able to use my science to see how he did it. And if evolution is a description of how God creates, what's wrong with that? God could be creating quickly or slowly. It's the same God. And there's nothing unusual about that. That's not me in the 21st century trying to make excuses. You find this in St. Augustine, who wrote a fascinating little book called On the Literal Interpretation of Genesis back in the year, 400? Mm-hmm. And when you read it, you realize his idea of literal is really different from my friend's ideas of literal, but that he knows that God can only be described in poetry because I know that only science can be described in poetry. And F equals GMM over R squared is a beautiful poem where every letter in that description, in that equation, is a metaphor for something in the real world, but can't possibly capture the real world itself.
You know, if a person of faith holds their Bible or any other faith in their document, how do you handle dinosaurs? How do you square those?
I don't know, but this is one of the reasons why I'm confident that the people who will answer the pollsters that say, well, 1/3 of the country says they don't believe in evolution. I don't think they're saying that in a scientific sense. I think they're saying this in this is where I stand in the culture war sense. Because oftentimes you will have them say yes or no, the world was made 6,000 years ago. Oh, they'll say yes. Yes or no, dinosaurs roamed the world millions of years ago. Well, of course, everybody knows that. And they're not answering these in mathematical ways. They're answering these in terms of where do I want to stand in the issues going on in our culture today.
Can I just say something about the dinosaurs? And this is, okay, I've got to get this out as well. The Brontosaurus, again, sort of, there was one, I grew up with it, it was not one, and now it's back again. How am I ever going to trust science? Okay, that's just my, but I think about the delight that, I watched a child play with dinosaurs. And this is this is an imaginative thought, but who's to say that God didn't enjoy watching dinosaurs? We read Scripture, we have a sense of the delight that God takes in the creation, that God just enjoys the goodness of what God has made. Who are we to say that God didn't say, wow, I really like the Brontosaurus?
Yeah, so what, are we supposed to believe that he corralled them when Adam and Eve showed up at the Garden of Eden? You know what, they're a little too big, let's corral them.
That's what the Flintstones were for. Remember, at the end of the workday, Fred, the whistle blew and he slid down the Bronto's neck.
What's in it for the Catholic Church to have the type of investment they have with the observatory? I think you said there are, 12 astronomers?
Right.
What's in it for them?
Well, we come cheap, because we're all Jesuits.
You take the oath of poverty, I get it.
You've heard the phrase DINK, dual income, no kids? Well, we've got 12 incomes, no kids, so it's, life is easy. It's frankly, the biggest thing, I can give you lots of spin-offs and all of that. The biggest thing is just the reminder every day that the scientific way of looking at the universe is a way of having fun with the universe. And that this is an important element, just as painting frescoes of the lives of saints is a way of celebrating those saints. Just as building glorious buildings at a time when Europe is racked with plague and wars is a way of reminding people that there is something beautiful that you can have, that we can all share, even in the face of the day-to-day trials that we have. I think it's all part of that same tradition, whether it's the tradition of literature, the tradition of great architecture, the tradition of great art.
When the Pope decided to put an opinion and a face to the global warming issue, what was the reaction within your community? Was it he's taking a big chance or good for the pontiff that he would do this? What was the reaction?
Well, certainly the first reaction was good for him. And we needed somebody with authority to be able to remind people that we can all argue about what to do about it. I mean, I have a lot of friends on the right who want to close their eyes and pretend the problem doesn't exist. I have a lot of friends on the left who will recognize the problem and have come up with some really terrible ideas to deal with it. We need to talk to each other. We need the people who have a practical sense of what works in the real world to deal with the issues that sometimes we don't want to see. But if you read the encyclical, there's a deeper message to all of this. And it's that the problem is real. The problem, you could say, was, arose from the misuse of technology. But it doesn't have only a technological fix. The problem also comes from human pride, from human greed, from human, go down the 7 deadly sins. They've all got a variant in the abuse of the world that comes from the fact that we're fallen. We are sinners. And we have to deal with that every day. And there isn't one of us here who can say, I'm perfect. And there's not one of us here who could read that encyclical and not get uncomfortable at one time or another. If you can read that and say, oh yeah, I've got this set, he's not talking about me. He's talking about what you should be doing, not what then you missed the point.
David, you're in a unique position to comment on this. You deal with not only Christians, the Roman Catholics, which we have a lot of on campus in Embry-Riddle, but a whole variety of faiths, different degrees of Muslim faith, scientists. Do you hear, and they're coming through your place, a lot of questions in that struggle in different faiths between their faith and science? Do you hear that?
Not so much, and one of the questions I have, I think, for a larger conversation is the extent to which the religion-science debate is somewhat of a Christian and science debate. And I know we'll be hearing from one of our faculty members here in terms of thinking about Muslims and Islamic science later on, and he can say much more about it than I can. But my understanding is that within Islam, there's just a strong sense, again, shared by many Christians, that by studying the creation, one is studying and learning about God, and that goes hand in hand together. Many Jews that I know are also very serious about their commitment of studying the Creator, studying the world that God has made, this infinite sense of, or maybe not infinite, but just this wonderful reception that we have of a gift of God's world, so that works very nicely. I've got a chance to know one of our Hindu students in here, and he talks about how he's an engineer, and so he talks that before an exam he prays to, one of the manifestations to the deity, who's dedicated to science and learning, and so I think it helps. I'm not sure. I have to check to see if it works for him. But for him, again, it goes together. There's that the deity, however understood in his understanding of Hinduism, has a vested interest in our understanding of the world and our pursuit of knowledge. So I think it is within certain Christian circles or contexts that we find it more problematic, whether it's because of miracles, and how can a rational, orderly God who would make scientific laws do things that seem to violate the laws that the God has made, or whether it's a debate about creation or evolution. I don't want to say it's a specifically Christian problem, but I'm really refreshed by listening to people of other traditions and other faiths, because they're much more easily find that combination of their own faith, their own commitment, their own theological tradition, and their love of science, their love of studying. And that's one of the things that's fantastic about our students. They do love to learn.
One of the things I found being part of, living in Europe and here, and then encountering people in many other continents, I'd say it's not even Christian, I'd say it's Western. It's specifically from the United States, you find it. And actually only in the last 30 years or so. You didn't find that kind of creationism outside of maybe the Seventh-day Adventists in the 1950s and 60s. It's a modern idea, and it's a specifically Western idea. You don't find this among Christians in Africa. You don't find it among Christians in Asia, for the very reasons you point out. But more than that, I think it comes, fundamentalism in general comes when you feel that the things you hold important are under threat, and you want to hold on tightly to the things you can be sure of. There are fundamentalists of many stripes. I know science fundamentalists who desperately want to hold on to the old-time religion of Newtonian physics because it gave them certainty, and it gave them a way that they could calculate everything to the nth degree. That sense of fear is what makes one become a fundamentalist, but that means that you have no faith in your faith. One thing I know is that my science is not perfect. My science I can understand because it's a human-made law, but it's never going to be a perfect description of the truth. One thing I know in my religion is that it's based on truths that I don't understand. And I will never completely understand my religion. So there is not only plenty of wiggle room for the two to fit together eventually, there's also a sense of joy that that's not all there is. That my understanding of God is not limited to what I learned in confirmation class. That there's more yet to be discovered. Just as there's more yet to be discovered in science, and I'm never going to run out of cool things to do in the lab.
David,
and a chance to ask for money for it.
in our early discussions about doing this, you cited to me one of the things that was impressed upon you was words from an astronaut who, looking down on the Earth, thought, how could you see something so perfectly created and somehow not believe that there is a God? Could you go with that?
Yeah, and this is, here's my historian's hat, so I'll say it's reported by the astronaut to a friend. And so the documentation is appropriately, I don't want to say cautious, but I'll be respectful of that. So the story, but as the story goes, that Yuri Gagarin, who was the first astronaut in space, has allegedly said, or did say when he got back to Earth, was broadcasting from his capsule, I'm out in space and there's no God. Okay, turns out, according to the friend, that Gagarin was a devout Russian Orthodox person, and he was saying that because that's what Khrushchev wanted him to say. And as we all know, if you were in Khrushchev's Soviet Union, you said what Khrushchev wanted you to say. Good example of how your scientific materialism can get in the way of many things. So the story is that when he got back to Earth and he was talking with his friend in private, he said, how on earth can you possibly get up there and not? How can you not think of God? And so I love that story as an example of someone who, again, that sense of wonder, that sense of amazement, that sense of awe. And he has grown up in scientific dogma as taught by the Soviet academies. And yet he still was overcome. And he retained that sense of faith and was able to share it privately. If he had tried to share it publicly, well, bad things would have happened. So that's a great example, I think, of sort of the way in which a political regime can influence the human experience. And again, that experience you're talking about, how we make sense of the world, that combines lots of different things in the fullness of our being persons. Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember 1968, which was not a happy year in many ways. And at Christmas time in 1968, the Apollo 8 astronauts went around the moon. They didn't land, but they did orbit. And it was Christmas Eve. And after a world that had been torn apart by race riots and the war in Vietnam, and upheaval and assassinations, terrible assassinations. And that's in America. The same thing happening in Europe. 1968 was one of those years that people shudder about when they remember what was happening in Paris and what was happening in Germany. And the astronauts, looking at the moon, read from the opening passage of Genesis. And this was their message which again reminds me of the cathedrals built at the time of plagues, to say that, yes, we human beings can and do terrible things to each other, but when we work together, we're not only able to do something as spectacular as go to the moon, but when we do that, we are inspired to look even beyond ourselves to something greater than ourselves.
Recently, I got an email from you, as all three of us would be emailing over the last several months, and you ended the email to me with happy gravitational waves. When the story hit, what was your reaction, and how does it work with science and faith?
My reaction, I'll be perfectly frank, was, my friend Keith must be so happy because he's been working on that experiment for so long. Science is a small world, and we all know each other. So that was a personal sense of this guy who had been in Baton Rouge for 10 years trying to make this thing work. He had dropped hints that it was going to happen. It was not a surprise. We kind of knew it was coming. But we were so delighted that, I mean, the miracle was not that they found gravitational waves. Sooner or later, we were going to find them. The miracle was that this group was able to hold themselves together and get funding for 20 years to do this incredibly complicated and delicate experiment that, frankly, isn't going to make anybody rich or famous. And yet, it's a confirmation that we're on the right track, that our understanding of the universe isn't totally wrong. And also, as astronomers, we now have a new tool to look at the universe to uncover things we wouldn't have been able to see before. But I've got a story about the LIGO, the whole experiment. And 20 years ago, when they were trying to get funding for it, the head of the National Science Foundation and one of the chiefs of the LIGO experiment was going around in Congress trying to raise money from the Congress. And they went to a particular Southern senator known to be very conservative and very hard-nosed. And as they're explaining the experiment and why they needed, $1 billion to make this thing work, the senator is nodding and going, of what possible practical use is this experiment? And before the NSF guy could come up with the usual spiel, the head of the experiment goes, of none at all. It's for pure knowledge. And the senator goes, so in other words, there's no reason why private enterprise would pay for it. I guess the government will have to. And he signed on.
Wow. Whoa. David, are people of faith to believe that God will allow knowledge and understanding and things, as Brother Guy says, to come into our consciousness in his time?
His time in the sense of?
That God determines. People of faith believe that God determines when the understanding comes to us?
There's a wide variety on that, I would say. So in people of faith, that's a couple billion. So I think and it does, I think, let me speak from the Christian tradition, so I can do that a little more readily. And I think that persons who grow up in the life of a church or experience faith in a community will notice over time that they go to a church and they hear a sermon on something. The same passage comes up every 3 years if you're in a 3-year preaching cycle, and it may take 20 years, or 21 to multiple 3, and someone finally says, oh, that passage is about me. And that may be a product of time, a product of maturity, a product of our relationships. It could be direct work of the Holy Spirit. So I think the answer is yes. I think there's a sense that and I think it's one of the interesting questions for science, is also the role of the Spirit, which is completely unpredictable. The image of the Spirit moving where the Spirit wills, can't control that. So I think it's, if I'm understanding am I understanding your
Yeah,
your
absolutely.
And it's for a similar kind of reason. I think there are times when we're drawn into a mode of gratitude, of wonder, of and happens because of life circumstances, happens because of a tragedy, happens because we are a grateful recipient of someone in our lives who just loves us even though we really have been pretty crummy. And we're drawn into these moments that suddenly open us up to a sense of, yeah, I think there's something going on. And I think it's hard to predict, it's impossible to predict and impossible to control. And I think that's one of the beauties of thinking in these terms and asking that kind of question, is it is a living relationship. And I'm always concerned when we say, okay, here's read this, and when you get to page 58, take a pause, and keep going. It's a living relationship, and just with everybody else, as we get to know one another in the depths of our time, we do discover more. Sometimes it's not pretty, but sometimes.
We're going to come to our colleagues in the audience, and we're going to also offer students the opportunity to ask your questions for Brother Guy or Reverend Keck. 2 microphones are set. If you can come down here, we're going to give you an extra moment to make your way down here. Let me first ask Victoria to come over for the first of our 2 colleagues here. Dr. Ted Von Hippel, your comment and your contribution. He knows Brother Guy as well as Reverend Keck.
Thank you. That was very enjoyable. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an astronomer here in the Physical Sciences Department at Embry-Riddle. If you could, Brother Guy, speak a little more to uncertainty in science, uncertainty in religion. One of the problems we as educators have is helping students transition from the science they learned in in grade school, high school, that seems very certain, to the science we're learning in college level, it's cutting edge, uncertainty, and the uncertainty that's left is that God, this whole God of the gaps sort of question. If you could speak.
Right. There's a great temptation to assign God to the role of explaining whatever it is we weren't able to explain in science. That's the famous God of the gaps. Newton started with this. He had the laws of gravity that explained planetary motion, but he couldn't figure out why the planets didn't perturb each other. Turns out they do, but so small that it doesn't matter. Laplace came up with a theory that explained you didn't need God to keep things going. As soon as you have a God of the gaps and then find out you didn't need God, then you suddenly become an atheist. The mistake, fundamental mistake, is thinking that God is a force alongside gravity, or a force alongside electricity, or then you've got Zeus again. Then you've got the nature gods, rather than a supernatural God. There's an example I love to give. Stephen Hawking a few years ago had a book that claimed, Stephen and his co-author, who had a long name that nobody can pronounce, like it wasn't Consolmagno, but it was just as bad, claimed that you no longer needed God to start the Big Bang, because he worked out the mathematics that convinced him that a random quantum fluctuation in the primordial gravity field would be enough to trigger the Big Bang. And therefore, you don't need God. Now, the first mistake is to say that God is whatever it is that started the Big Bang, and make that identification. But if you do make that identification, you say God is what started the Big Bang, but in fact, gravity is what started the Big Bang, then logically, God is gravity. Which maybe explains why Catholics celebrate Mass.
Mm-hmm.
I've been waiting half an hour to use that joke. The point is to recognize, first of all, that God is not a part of nature, but supernatural. God doesn't know the future. God remembers the future because he's outside of time as well as outside of space. The second and equally hard thing is to recognize that though God is all-powerful, God chooses to give us freedom, which is to say that from our point of view, living in time, there is a certain fundamental unpredictability. I believe in free will, and you can't convince me otherwise. If you could convince me otherwise, then that would be a contradiction, of course. But because there is freedom, because we have a God who has chosen to withdraw this power, we have a God who, when he decided to become incarnate in the Christian belief, he didn't come down on a cloud of glory so that everybody's going to go, oh, that's God all right, but instead came as a baby. That tells us something about the vision of God we have. This means that uncertainty and unpredictability, though it can be uncomfortable, is also fundamental to what makes this universe tick. So when you say that, does God plan that we're going to know things over time? God gives us the time, and we can choose whether or not to decide to understand or not, whether or not to decide to go forward or to be busy doing other things. God gives us this enormous freedom. And having said all that, I reflect back on my own life, where I was convinced by the time I was 30 that God had given me the freedom to choose any kind of life I wanted, and as long as I did a good choice, God would be happy with it. And through a bizarre series of accidents, I found myself stumbling into becoming a Jesuit, only to discover that that's what God wanted all the time.
That's kind of
dare he!
That's kind of hard to do, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's a long story.
Dr. Mohammed Kamara is with us as well this evening. Dr. Kamara, thank you and your contribution tonight.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Brother Guy and Reverend Keck. I'm Mohammed Kamara. I'm a professor of history and international relations in the Department of Security Studies and International Affairs. As I listen to you, Brother Guy, you are a man of religion and a scientist. That takes me to a point of convergence that I believe exists between different traditions, faith traditions, and particularly between the religions of the Abrahamic tradition, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I'm saying that because in Islam, it is also believed that the divine is intrinsically unknowable. But seeking knowledge as part of your daily endeavor is one of the surest ways to take you every single day closer to the divine. My question to you is to help us shed light on the similarities that may exist among different faith traditions in terms of seeking knowledge, not only sacred knowledge, but also scientific knowledge, and how important those similarities should be today in our highly spiritually, religiously divided modern world.
A year ago in January, at the Vatican Observatory, we had an interesting convention with imams from Iran. The government of Iran has been very interested in the Vatican Observatory, and we had ambassadors coming and visiting us. One of the ambassadors specifically invited me to come to Iran and talk to them. I said, I am a US citizen. And he said, we can get you into Iran, no problem. I'm going, that's not what I'm worried about. But in a funny way, Iran and the Vatican, Iran sees the Vatican as the other major theocracy in the world. But more to the point, the conference, the study week, was about the role of astronomy in our faiths. Not so much that you learn about the heavens by studying heaven or vice versa, but rather that we both have long traditions of astronomy. We have both learned so much from each other. Anybody here who studies astronomy knows that half the stars begin with the word al something or another. They're Muslim names. That we study them using algebra, which is a Muslim word. That it was the Muslim world that preserved the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Babylonians and enriched it so that all of the West. Also that it is in the cultures of the Abrahamic tradition that science was so respected and supported, even though it doesn't make you rich. That science gets started here compared to the phenomenally developed and profoundly deep culture of China or India, who somehow didn't think that science was worth doing because the study of, proper study of humanity is man. There is finally this marvelous truth that we all live under the same sky. This was the theme of the International Year of Astronomy in 2009. And it was a theme that, as we would go out into the world to talk about astronomy, I discovered over and over again was true, not just different faith traditions, different educational levels. You can take a 7-year-old out and point out the stars, and that 7-year-old is going to be every bit as thrilled as you are with all your knowledge. When I was 30 years old, and I was, long before I was a Jesuit, I was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT. I was in the big leagues. I was at MIT. I was a utility infielder, but I was in the big leagues. But I'd lie in bed at night wondering, why am I doing astronomy when people are starving in the world? What a waste. And I didn't have an answer. So I quit astronomy. I left MIT. I joined the Peace Corps, which is a fantastic thing to do, by the way. Best 2 years of my life. I really loved it. But they sent me to Africa. They sent me to Kenya. And the first thing the Kenyans asked was, you're an astronomer? Tell us about astronomy. Let us look through your telescope. Show us those pictures that NASA have sent back from the moon. Tell us what that's all about. And as I would set up my little telescope in a remote village upcountry in Kenya, everybody looking through the telescope going, wow, just like my friends and family back in Michigan go, wow. I realized, you know, I had a very clever cat in those days, but my cat never wanted to look through the telescope. Only human beings look at the stars and wonder, but all human beings look at the stars and wonder. And that desire to know more is a sign of the presence of God. Karl Rahner, in his book Grundkurs des Glaubens, has a couple of long German, actually short German words to try to get these ideas across. The wofür here, the wofür, the fact that you're desiring something out there and the stars are the first place you look for it. That's why we use the word heaven and heavens interchangeably. But the fact that there is something in you desiring the something out there are both evidences of the presence of God. And the fact that we can so beautifully and interchangeably take the science from Islam and the science from Christianity and the science from Judaism and each build on the other and then share it with our Muslim friends or share it with our non-Abrahamic friends so that the Chinese and the Japanese and the Indians also contribute because we have this common language because it's part of who we are as human beings. Three examples come to mind. Albert Einstein, a German Jew during World War I, publishes the theory of general relativity. During the war, Arthur Eddington, an English Quaker, makes the arrangements to make the observations that allows him to prove Einstein was right, even though the two were at war and terrible enemies. You have Copernicus writing his book about the origin and orientation of the planets, and he's on his deathbed, and it's published not in Catholic Poland, but in Protestant Germany by his friends during the height of the worst times of the Reformation, the two different religious traditions talking to each other. Science, astronomy in particular, is something that allows everybody to have something to talk about. You were telling the story earlier at dinner tonight about the fellow who found himself suddenly in the company of princes and dukes and didn't know what to say until some sporting event came up and they discovered they're all sports fans together. We need these points of religion, whether it's science or sport or whatever, to remind ourselves of our common humanity.
We're going to take some questions from the audience. Students or the general public, please come down to our microphones. If you can do so right now, you can ask your question. Usually we try to go up into the audience, but if you can come down, step up. We'll take our first question of the night. Thank you.
Good evening, Brother Guy. My name's Jameson Petrowski. I'm actually a senior in mechanical engineering, also from Michigan. My question for you, my freshman year, I read your book, Brother Astronomer. And at a point in it, you talk about your Antarctic expedition and that every morning you set some time aside that was yours and that you focused on your faith. And my question is, there's a number of students in the audience, both from the Catholic Student Union, as well as friends of mine from other traditions. What would you like to say to students of faith and of science? One, that are maybe on their own asking the tough questions independently for the first time, or looking to go out into the world and practice both their faith as well as the careers that we've been preparing for.
First of all, to spend time, whether it's 15 minutes a day, not doing your work, not doing the chores, not doing anything but staring off into space, and learning to turn off the noise in your head. Somebody was describing to me, I think it was Father, that there's something I didn't know, but you guys would probably all know, that there's a moment in the cockpit of an airplane where you stop talking. What's the phrase they use for that?
Listen to JC, the ATC.
Yeah, the sterile cockpit. And everybody needs that moment before you take off in your day. And if you think you're wasting those 15 minutes, you'll be surprised how much you gain the rest of the day by remembering what's important, by remembering The second thing is to recognize you're not alone. You mentioned all the other members of your faith group here. The weirdest thing that happened to me when I became a Jesuit, I was 37, 38 years old, and I did a summer working at the Goddard Space Flight Center as a Jesuit novice, working with people whom I had known for 20 years as fellow astronomers, but now I've come out of the closet. I'm a Jesuit, I'm a believer. And it's scary. What are they going to think? And I remember one woman in particular who I had known since she was a grad student, who all the other grad students referred to as she who must be obeyed. She was scary. And she would find, mistakes faster than you could make them. And she said, I've got to talk to you. What she wanted to talk to me about was her parish and her faith. And this happened over and over and over again. By being a Jesuit with the MIT ring, I've given my fellow nerds an excuse, permission to talk about their faith life. And that doesn't mean proselytizing. That doesn't mean trying to convince people that I'm right and you're wrong. But just that we're friendly enough, we have enough faith in each other that we recognize we're not alone. I think most of the books I write are not to convince people. I'm not going to change anybody's mind with a book. And I would be worried about a faith that was changed by reading a book. But it's to reassure people that they're not alone. And that what our religion has is language to help us deal with the issues that everybody deals with, but somehow it's easier when you know the equations that can handle it, than when you know the language that can deal with it. Everybody in this room probably was raised close to, if not in, a faith. And that faith has got a lot of support structure to help you out. Don't worry about the things that don't make sense to you, any more than you should worry about the things in quantum physics that don't make sense to you. Set that aside for the moment. Use the tools that you've got, because they work. That's why they're there.
We're over here. Go ahead, David. Then we'll take from over here.
Talk about the importance of, thank you, Jameson. Think about the importance of rest, that moment of repose, that moment of silence or stillness. Again, it goes back to the creation and the Sabbath, the gift of Sabbath, the Sabbath rest. So some of the themes we've been talking about in terms of creation, the goodness of the world, the enjoyment, receiving it as a gift. 15 minutes a day, the mini Sabbath in the middle of the day.
I'm going to remember that now. Over here now, your question.
My name is Charles Sayers. I'm a senior here at Embry-Riddle. Speaking to what you guys were talking about earlier, what I notice most in the lines between evolution and creationism is this huge argument over how old the Earth is. Is it thousands of years old? Is it billions of years old? As an evolutionist, I don't have a problem believing that some higher power had a hand in 65 billion years of evolution. I don't have a problem believing that there was some sort of influence there. But the wall that I run into most of the time when having debates with people of faith is that there's no possible way that the Earth could only be more than, or could be any more than a few thousand years old. I feel like if we could all agree on an approximate age for the Earth, then we could get on to deciding who did or did not create it and how they did or did not do that.
You want a consensus.
So, my question to you is, what do you say to these people? What do you say to the evolutionists? What do you say to the young people of faith, the people who believe that it was thousands of years old and the people who believe that it was billions of years old, to try to draw these factions together under science? Because you said earlier about religions building consecutively on each other, like bringing all their science together. So what do you tell them to try to bridge this gap and bring 5,064 billion a little closer to the middle?
Good luck.
I'm not going to convince anybody. I know that ahead of time. And my goal isn't to convince them that they're wrong and I'm right, even though they are wrong and I am right. But if I can convince them that I'm not an evil person for believing something different from them, that I have sincere reasons to believe. I've got a whole boatload of arguments that I use in favor of the geologically 4.567 billion year age of the meteorites that I study. The universe might have been created 6,000 years ago with all of those isotopes where they are. The universe might have been created 2 minutes ago with all the memories in my head. I cannot prove otherwise. I can only ask which version of creation is closer to the God I read in Scripture and the God I experience in my life. A trickster God who set things up to hide dinosaur fossils just to fool me, or a God who does things in God's own time and sets wonderful but fair puzzles for our mutual enjoyment and entertainment. Because ultimately it's not a scientific question, it's a theological question. Years ago, I was in a train in England, in Italy rather, and I was riding first class, because if you're an American and you get a rail pass, you get to ride first class, which is cool. The people in the compartment with me were also Americans riding first class. And we're looking at the beautiful Italian scenery, and they're launching into a long diatribe about the religious right and how terrible they are and all of this. And, you know, I lived many years in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I've heard all this before. You know, whether I agree with them or not, and I did agree with them, but come on, we're in Italy. Let's look at the scenery. So just to shut them up, I looked at them, I put on this very serious face, and I said, you realize the problem with the religious right is that they've been marginalized by the intelligentsia in America. And I figure all of these buzzwords will shut, and it did. It was great. And then I realized it's actually true. That no wonder people who disagree with me are not going to listen to me if they think that I think that they're idiots. Then there's no room for a conversation. How do you get past that? I can't change them, but I can change me. And it's not necessarily in what I believe, but how I believe it and how I embrace people who... There's a wonderful story of Isaac and Abraham. Abraham takes Isaac up to the mountain, ties Isaac to the rock, is about to sacrifice Isaac, and the voice from heaven comes to spare the child. My liberal friends, when first told by God to sacrifice Isaac, would have said, "Get lost, God," and walked away. My conservative friends, when they were ready to plunge the dagger and God says, "Stop," would have said, "No, no, no, I know better." We can't either of us be so wed to our own way of looking at the universe.
Right over here. Miss, your question. It's all right, you can move it. Go ahead. We want to hear you.
So my name is Maggie Gallant. I'm president of the Student Astronomy Club on campus. But I'm not going to ask you about astronomy. I'm going to ask you about quantum mechanics, which you've been talking about all night. So there's this concept we've been learning in quantum mechanics. I'm in that class this semester, that when you're doing an experiment and you try to take a measurement, the observer actually disturbs the experiment and changes the measurement. And earlier you described Newton's law of gravitation so beautifully. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that concept in quantum mechanics as a person of faith.
It's beautiful. It reminds us that the universe is more complicated than Newton's mechanistic view. But Newton's mechanistic view still works well enough that these airplanes fly. You've got to hold those two things in balance. The great temptation is to say that God exists in the quantum uncertainty. It's just God of the gaps again, only it's a really, really tiny gap. I think that misses the point of God, where God is, what God is. I think it is absolutely beautiful to recognize that something as wonderfully mysterious and completely counterintuitive as quantum mechanics underlies the fabric of the universe. On the other hand, do you remember when you were a freshman taking Newtonian physics? That seemed pretty counterintuitive at the time, too. We should be prepared for that. We should be prepared to be surprised. And we should never lose our taste for surprise, and never lose our taste for being able to say, "I never thought of that. That's so cool." And in that joy that you feel in recognizing quantum mechanics, or maybe in the frustration, I think you feel a sense of the presence of God. Not that God is in the atoms, but God is in the joy that we as human beings have when we understand the atoms.
I went through some tape over the weekend, and this is something you said. You've known some popes in your day, a few of them.
A few of them, yeah.
You said,
I don't know, some popes have known me.
what was I thinking? Pope Benedict pointed out the role of agnostics in our culture to keep us honest. I found that interesting. Could you explain that?
Oh, absolutely. This is something, C.S. Lewis has it in his stories. You need the skeptic. You need the skeptic to stop you from thinking you've got it all pat and you've got it all settled. Everybody needs someone who will constantly be a thorn in their side to wake them up, to keep them going. Sometimes you marry them, I don't know. Says the guy with the vow of celibacy. We need to not get too comfortable. And I think that skepticism, agnosticism, at the end of the day, a scientist, an agnostic scientist, fundamentally believes in truth. You could fake so much in science, especially in a science like astronomy where it doesn't matter. And you could make wild claims that won't be disproved until you're long dead. But in the meanwhile, you've gotten the prize and you've gotten tenure and you've gotten the... I don't know any astronomer who would do that.
Yeah.
Because we're dedicated to the truth. It's not fun if it's not true. But truth is this abstract, this transcendental, that is God. And so even a skeptic who is skeptical because they want to know the truth in a deeper way is worshiping God.
David.
I know that one of my favorite stories from Scripture is the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel, or the manifestation of God as an angel. And remember the story, the two are wrestling, they wrestle all night, and they're doing a World Wrestling Federation body slam moves, and it goes on for a long time. And at the end of this, he gets his hip dislocated. But what happens is he has discovered, earned, or is given a new name, Israel, which means roughly the one who wrestles with God. And I've always taken, as a Christian, I've taken some of those who believe we're in continuity with Israel. And so I've always taken that as a message, that part of what we are supposed to do is to wrestle with God. So we take in that skepticism. We honor the doubt. We wrestle. We cry out when something awful happens. And whether it's an issue of moral evil, an issue of doubt, or wrestling with our faith and uncertainty, I think all of those things are part of who we are supposed to be. And that God honors that. God honors that process where we're honest and we say, God, I don't get it. What is going on?
Yeah.
And it's not like God doesn't know what I'm already thinking. And so I can try to be polite and go, hi. And God's going to say, you're bugged, aren't you? You're kind of... So God knows what's in my heart. God knows I'm angry. God knows I have doubt. God knows that I'm weak in my faith. And if I don't wrestle with that, I'm dishonoring God. But if I do say, I don't get it. What's going on here? I think God honors that. And God responds with a sense of, okay, let's talk.
The religious writer Anne Lamott has a wonderful phrase. The opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. If you've got certainty, you don't need faith. It's when you're doubting and yet you decide to go forward anyway that you have faith. To go on to the wrestling, as speaking as someone who had 20 years of terrible relationships before I finally gave up and joined the Jesuits. Much easier life this way. But I recognized a common thread in most of my failed girlfriend relationships was that I was always afraid to have an argument with her. If you're not willing to have an argument, you don't trust that person. You don't really love that person. You have to be able to have an argument with God.
For both of you, are people of faith commanded to God when they make discoveries?
Commanded?
Scientific, are you to give thanks to God when you make a scientific discovery?
I don't do it because I'm commanded to. It's the first thing that comes to mind. It's
Or maybe command is not the right word. Are you supposed to, if you believe strongly in your faith, do you give it up to God and thank Him?
I had a roommate when I was living in Boston, and he was madly in love with a girl named Marcia. And so he came back, around Valentine's Day. He said, "I bought her a dozen roses. You won't believe how much it cost in Boston. But if this doesn't get Marcia, nothing will." And he was right, nothing would. A year later, he met the woman who's become his wife, and they're tremendously in love 30-odd years later. I'm sure he buys her roses all the time. But it's not to win her love, but to express his love. In the same way, when I give thanks to God because I've just had this really glorious insight, it's not because I think He wants me to. It's because I want to.
By the way, before you became a Jesuit, you dated a lot, didn't you?
Not all that much. It's just that they were all memorable. They were all brilliant.
We've been listening to stories today. I'm like,
Yeah.
wow.
Well, they're all smart enough not to marry me. Number one, I only dated smart women.
Yes, sir, your question.
Speaking of skeptics and agnostics, I wonder if either of you have any thoughts about Einstein's statement that his God was the God of Spinoza.
Einstein came at a fabulous time in the history of human thought because he was the crucial end of the Enlightenment, you might say, and the beginning of the modern era. But he came out of the Enlightenment, and he was a person of the Enlightenment. He will never not be a person of the Enlightenment. And the God of Spinoza was the God of the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment was sort of the adolescence of human thought, where you had all of those ideas that seemed like they ought to be true, and it turned out they're not quite. But it was a necessary and really valuable period to go through. Certainly the God of Spinoza is better than the picture of God you had when you were 5 years old, as the big daddy in the sky. But in a funny way, the big daddy in the sky is not a bad picture if you recognize that it's so obviously inadequate, I'll never be fooled to thinking that it's true. The problem with the God of Spinoza is that it's not so obviously inadequate that you might be fooled into thinking it's true.
Right over here.
Hello, my name is Alexander Stone Martinez. I'm a freshman studying astronomy and astrophysics. This is kind of more about you. So when I was younger, I was influenced into coming into science by I can really think of two people. One I never knew and never could meet, Carl Sagan, influenced me. He died before I was even born, but has influenced my life greatly. And recently I've really started kind of realizing how much my father has influenced me. And I'm just wondering who or what really influenced you into becoming someone to search the truth when you were younger, search for science, truth in your faith, and so on?
Probably the single biggest influence on me was my advisor in college, which is an odd thing to say, because I went to MIT mostly to read science fiction. My best friend was going there, and I found they had the world's largest collection of science fiction in the MIT Science Fiction Library. And only after I got there did I fall in love with the science itself. And it was because of my advisor, a fellow named John Lewis, who was a student himself of Harold Urey, a Nobel Prize winner, who was a student of G.N. Lewis, the famous chemist. And you can go online and find just a long line of brilliant people. John was a seeker. And he was always looking into strange and wonderful new things, and eventually became a Mormon, which gives me tremendous respect now for Mormons, a religion that otherwise I'd say, you got to be kidding. Well, no, there's some smart people who believe in that. But the one moment that really inspired me watching him as a student, he had a beautifully elaborate theory for the chemistry of the solar system. And one of the predictions it made was that there would be, if you could get a sample of the Earth's core, it would be rich in sulfur. Someone had discovered a xenolith in a formation that they were convinced came from the core, and it was not rich in sulfur, it was rich in silicon. And I'm going, well, aren't you disappointed if your theory's wrong? And he goes, the heck with the theory. Maybe we've got data. That's much more exciting than having my theory proved right or wrong. I go, wow, he's right. Turns out it wasn't a piece of the core, and as far as I know, his theory is still doing okay. But the fact that the truth made him far more excited than being proved right or wrong reminded me again of why we do this stuff in the first place. So I knew Carl Sagan, of course. I knew him first as a young man and saw him as he became an impossible egotist that drove everyone nuts. And then as he actually, late in life, as he was dying, became much more humble and much more approachable again, and sort of redeemed in that sad final chapter. He died of a terrible kind of cancer.
Tell the story about the woman.
Yes, I was giving a talk, and afterwards a little old lady came up and said, have you read this book by Dr. Sagan? That's his. And I said, well, ma'am, you know, I was a friend of Carl Sagan's, which is stretching it a little bit. I had, known him a few times over the years. Like, I was a friend of him, and he was a wonderful man. And she goes, yes, I know. He was my brother.
Oops.
Can I just want to?
Yeah, David, please.
Love that question, and I wonder if I connect that with Ted's question earlier about sort of how do we help students wrestle with that frontier of uncertainty or thinking of science differently? Because I think there's not sure I can put my finger on it, but there's that sense of wonder, that sense of being drawn in, that sense of the delight that you take in entering into the uncertain. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as you teach, you're entering into something that we don't really quite know yet, and yet there's a sense of discovery, a sense of truth that can be discovered, a sense of willing to be wrong because there's something more fantastic that happens when you say yes. And I just wonder for us as a community, whether that's just a terrific question, how do we encourage that amongst ourselves? And then with the students, how do we, instead of having them focus on what's the right answer in the box, how do we cultivate that love of truth, that love of learning, that love of pursuit of something which we may not find in our lifetime, but gosh, it's worth going after.
And how will you feel in 40 years' time when some kid says that they were inspired by you? Because somebody's got to do it.
David, you have been quoted as saying, I had a call to minister, and I've always been involved in academic matters. Combining the two is what I really enjoy, ministering in an academic setting. This is a very specific love of yours. Would you speak to that?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. It's and Father Tim Daly, our Catholic chaplain, has that same sense. That sense that there's
Father
something
Daly,
wonderful.
good evening.
To me, it grows out of a recognition that, or from my point of view, recognition, but a belief, a commitment that the two institutions that I love, the academy and the church, really benefit from each other. And so I understand my life as trying to bring the best of the academy to the church, which is a question about the critical reflection, the disciplines required to understand, to know, the willingness to explore, the humility that comes from that. Bring that to the church and to bring the joys, the delights, the disciplines of the church to the academy. And I say church for me particularly, but I would mean for all different religious traditions, and encouraging that, the sense of the ethical framework, the morals, the sense of hope. The delight in a community of shared commitments, bringing that to the academy and seeing the two and trying to nurture the two together. So for me, it's trying to bring them together, not in a way where one gets subsumed under the other, because I think that sense of independence is important. I think we need to have two independent entities or ethos or cultures being willing to support but criticize and be critical, at the same time also celebrating. So that for me is a way in which I've lived that out, and I have a privilege of working with great faculty and staff and a colleague, Father Tim, and the students here, and just to see, helping to nurture them, because I think all of us involved in education, whether we're persons of faith or not, we love seeing that something happen in the student, allowing them to take that step.
And if I'm not mistaken, he also plays the harp. So you got that going for you. Over here, your question, please.
Hello? Hello, I'm
Hello.
John Galjanik. I'm studying aerospace engineering here. First off, I'd like to thank you both for coming to speak to us. It's a great honor. But I'd like to ask, if you were, going with the title of the book, if you were to meet an extraterrestrial and find out that their race had never heard of God or God had never chosen to reveal himself in any way, shape, or form to them, would that lead you to question your faith in any way?
It wouldn't, for kind of a reason that's a cheat. As I say, every rational system has to start with an axiom. And for me, my faith is my axiom. So everything else that I understand through the light of it. But I also know that my faith is unprovable. It cannot be proved. And so if I encountered such an alien, and there's a whole series of terrible science fiction books of exactly the Jesuit meets the aliens who are perfect but have never heard of God. I can think of 2 at least with that plot. And it's always Jesuits. And the trouble with those books is that I think they completely misunderstand how a Jesuit would react. I would react, I think, probably the way most of the students in this group would react, because we're all fellow techies together, which is, that's cool. How do you do that? And I would very quickly be able to convince myself that whatever it is they are living for, whatever it is that gives meaning to their life, if it really gives meaning to their life, it has to be outside of the universe that they're in. Wittgenstein says this, that a thing cannot have its meaning in itself, but only that chair has meaning only because there's somebody sitting in it. Without a person sitting in it, the chair is meaningless. Whatever it is where they find meaning, wherever it is that they find truth, wherever it is that they find love, that's God. And they've just got a different way of expressing it. But it would be fascinating to figure it out and to explore it together. Because, as I say, what religion brings me is not the sense of God. I already had that. What religion brings me is the language that allows me to deal with the experience of God that I've got. So you're talking about now a race with a completely different language to talk about the same concepts. I've had the joy of now learning Italian, so I can see 2 languages as close together as Italian and English. Nonetheless, each gives you insights into the world that the other didn't have. And in the same way, coming across a totally alien race with a totally alien way of interacting with God, and yet we're all part of the same creation, it's got to be the same God. That would be so much fun.
Looking for a couple more questions before we wrap up, but first, how do you handle the people who aren't fans of the observatory? I mean, isn't there a story out there somewhere that says that you have a telescope named Lucifer?
Oh, yes! I mean, it's very reassuring to have enemies. You know, they say if you haven't had an enemy by the time you're 40, you haven't done anything. It's only when people are willing to hate you that you must be doing something that is worth getting people upset. There is our telescope. We have a lovely telescope on the top of a mountain in southern Arizona, and we have a foundation that supports the telescope. Along with being the director of the observatory, I'm also the head of the foundation, so send your dollars too. More to the point, forget about sending the dollars for the moment. We've got a blog called The Catholic Astronomer where we have this conversation continually. Well, we've got this telescope. It's on the same mountaintop as the Large Binocular Telescope, which has the largest piece of telescopic glass in the world, 2 8.4 meter mirrors, lovely mirrors. And it's supported by an international group, including a crew from Germany, who decided to build an infrared detector. And they got the money from the government of a state in Germany, where I think it was the Minister of Education, was a fellow by the name of Teufel, which is a German word for devil. So as a joke, they invented an acronym for their instrument, the light something something something, that would spell out Lucifer. And they thought this was a great joke, and everybody got a good laugh. It got onto the internet, and the rest is history.
Okay. Your question, we'll take 2 more. Go ahead.
Hi there, I'm a member of the Brevard Astronomical Society. So I'm leaning towards a more technical question on what's going on at the Vatican Observatory in Arizona. I do a lot of remote observing from Arizona myself, so I'm curious what's a little less philosophical,
Right.
what overlaps. So.
The technical side is that we're now investing about $500,000 in upgrading the telescope so it can be operated robotically. It was designed 20 years ago to test out all sorts of ways to make telescopes work better. So it's got coolant running through it and fans blowing on it and all sorts of crazy go-fast things that will make it work well. But they're really complicated. More than most telescopes, it takes about half an hour to turn all the switches and levers and running up and down from the basement to the dome. We're going to roboticize it so that it's a 4-hour drive to get to the telescope. We can do this without having to do that drive. The science that we're doing on it, basically, the great thing about being a scientist at the Vatican, I don't have a 3-year grant cycle to worry about. I don't have a 6-year tenure cycle to worry about. So I can do projects that may take 20 years to come to fruition. I worked with some colleagues, one at the University of Oklahoma, another at Northern Arizona, to measure the colors of very faint objects, 21st magnitude objects, out beyond Pluto in our solar system, trans-Neptunian objects, to see if there's a pattern between the colors that they have and the orbits that they have. And to see a pattern, you've got to have a lot of data points. It's taken us 20 years to amass enough data points to see the pattern, but we're doing that now. We've got another fellow who's been working for 30 years on measuring the spectra of stars in clusters, especially clusters that are surrounded by gas, which can sometimes obscure their spectra. And he's testing out a system of filters that the Vilnius astronomers in Lithuania have developed. He's been doing this, as I say, for 20 years. They're getting results, and they're publishing that now. We have another astronomer who's using the telescope to measure peculiar stars and measuring the spectra of peculiar stars. So we've got lots of little tasks which are mostly in the order of catalogs, long-term survey programs. You discover cool things on small telescopes, and then you can get the time in the big telescope to confirm them and to go further. But you have to find them in the small telescope first, and ours is perfect for that.
This question, then we'll take that one, and then we're done. Go ahead. You are a little below, if we could get some help. You're not going to grow that fast. Go ahead.
What is it like working with the Pope?
Great question. Question of the night.
Everybody else wanted to ask that, but they were too scared to.
I mean, how do you get approval? I mean, what if he gives you the thumbs down? Where do you go?
Essentially, we don't need to ask for that kind of approval. We have a set budget, not a whole lot. It's 1/2% of the Vatican's budget, which ironically is the same proportion that NASA's budget is to the US government. 1/2%. Everybody thinks it's this vast amount of money, don't we wish? But when I arrived at the Vatican Observatory, my assignment directly was do good science, period. And I'm free to follow whatever the science is, wherever it goes. I've had the privilege of knowing 3 popes. I wouldn't say I was best friends of theirs, but I certainly got to know who they were. Everyone was different. Everyone was tremendously supportive. John Paul II, as he got older and weaker, became more and more powerful, so that to the last years of his life, you'd be in the room with him, and you just knew there was something special about this guy. It was amazing to be around, kind of scary. Benedict, who was the worst public speaker I've ever heard in my life. He would lecture at you like a German professor. But when you got him off stage, he had a wicked sense of humor. And when he came to visit our observatory, and he'd ask questions about the meteorites, and would start cracking jokes about the work we were doing, and very, well-educated jokes. He was by far one of the smartest people I've ever met. And a delight to be around. Francis has this, marvelous care for the poor, but he's also a Jesuit. And he's also somebody who, worked in chemistry before he got into the priesthood. He gets what we're doing, and he understands why it's important for what we do. And he's delighted. I was able to show him a meteorite that fell in Buenos Aires, where he grew up. And he had the same delighted look on his face that everybody who gets to touch a piece of outer space has. So it's very encouraging. But mostly, they're the kind of bosses who say, you guys are doing great work. Let me get out of your way and tell you and tell me at the end of the year the cool things that you've come up with. Best kind of boss you could have.
David.
I've not worked with 3 popes, but I have worked with 2 Embry-Riddle presidents.
Did they think they were infallible?
No comment. But I just wanted to lift up for our students, and again, as you're wrestling with exams and equations and complicated things, I think their message to you would be the same to the Pope's message: do good science. They love the work that happens here, and their delight is in seeing you thrive and knowing that when we're cold and in our tombs, the work that happens here will be influencing people all across the world. So do good. If I may speak for the presidents that I've the pleasure to work with, do good science.
And your question now for Brother Guy and Reverend Keck.
Thank you. I'm a freshman here studying aerospace engineering, and I believe you were on Star Talk Radio at one point. Was that correct?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I love that episode. Thanks.
Right, thanks.
My question to you is, when we're doing science as scientists, we're looking to create theories and to explore them. And a big thing that I think people misunderstand is that when you're trying to prove your theory, you're not trying to make sure that it's true, but maybe that it can't be falsified. And so I think you have a unique perspective to this aspect because you're dealing with that in the scientific community and the religious community. And I was wondering if you could expand on that as far as something that like you can't falsify.
We've got, we'll give an example. We've got the theory of orbits that Kepler came up with. Planets go around the sun in ellipses. And that matched the data that he had gloriously. Well, earlier, 2 centuries earlier, Ptolemy had a theory, well, 15 centuries earlier. Ptolemy had a theory that there were circles, and then circles within circles, and then circles within circles within circles. And if you have enough circles, an infinite number of circles, Fourier's theorem tells you, that will also match the orbit of any orbiting planet. So whose theory is better? The reason why Kepler's theory is better, we say, oh, it's simpler, it's more elegant, it led to insights that Ptolemy was not able to lead to. It led to Einstein or Newton's insight of the law of gravity. So whether a theory is good or bad is not merely does it match the data. I can come up with dozens of theories that match the data, but rather does it open up new questions. As a young man, I'd had these great conversations with my dad. He drove into high school every day. It was about a half-hour drive. And one of the stories, he says, knowledge is like an island. The more you know, the bigger the island. But the bigger the island, the longer the shoreline. And that shoreline is the boundary between what you know and that huge ocean of what you don't know. Which means the more you learn, the more you're aware of things you didn't even know you didn't know. So if you think you know everything, it's because your island is really, really tiny.
Before we conclude tonight, I want to thank some students who work with us, because without their assistance and the time that they dedicate, we couldn't make these things happen. Taylor Mobley, Tim Kristovic, Victorio Custodi, Taylor Lyons, Deepak Kumar, thank you for the time that you give in being part of this tonight. And Tony Petro, who has directed every one of our events, thank you, sir, for your good work. And of course, Bob Score, our videographer. Our next event will be on March the 28th. As we move back to the law, we'll talk with Judge Andrew Napolitano of the Fox News Channel, a former judge, and of course he is a teaching professor as well of law. We'll talk about privacy rights as they apply not only to drones, but to modern technology. That's next in the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series, March 28th at 7. The doors open at 6 here in the Gail Lemron Auditorium. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, Brother Guy, Reverend David Keck, thank you for being with us. And thank you all. Have a very pleasant good night.